Samantha Carter stood in the middle of her elegantly furnished high-rise apartment in downtown Chicago, swirling the wine in her glass as the sound of laughter filled the room. But it wasn't the warm, shared kind of laughter that brought people closer. It was the sharp, mocking sound of her husband Ethan's latest joke at her expense. "Oh, honey, you should have seen the way she tried to explain stock trends to me last night," Ethan said, his voice carrying easily over the conversation. "She went on and on, throwing out jargon like she was a Wall Street genius, and I just nodded, pretending to understand while she confused herself." The group of friends and colleagues chuckled, some of them awkwardly, others genuinely entertained. Samantha's practiced smile remained fixed in place, but inside she felt the familiar sting of embarrassment. It had become routine at these gatherings. Ethan was the star performer, the charming lawyer with a quick wit, and Samantha? She was his favorite punchline. Whether it was about her cooking, her occasional clumsiness, or the way she sometimes lost herself in work, Ethan always found a way to turn her into a joke. The worst part? No one ever questioned it. It was all in good fun, right? That's what she had told herself for years. Yet, the laughter always felt like needles pricking at her skin, each one a tiny puncture to her confidence. Tonight was supposed to be different. She had been recently promoted at her investment firm, and she had been looking forward to sharing the news. It was a big achievement, one she had worked tirelessly for, but the moment she opened her mouth to mention it, Ethan was already cutting in. "Oh, that's right, Samantha got a promotion," he said, slinging an arm around her shoulder in that possessive yet condescending way. "Honestly, I think she probably slept through the meeting where they announced it. You guys know how deep she sleeps. I could throw a party in our bedroom and she wouldn't wake up." The laughter rippled through the group again, and Samantha felt the heat rise to her cheeks. She tightened her grip on her wine glass, forcing herself to breathe evenly. For the past 6 years of their marriage, she had swallowed these humiliations, telling herself it was just Ethan's sense of humor. But as she looked around the room at their so-called friends, she saw Monica's hesitant expression, the way her lips pressed together as if she, too, was growing uncomfortable with the jokes. And for the first time, Samantha realized she wasn't the only one noticing Ethan's cruelty. Samantha exhaled slowly, trying to steady her nerves as Ethan continued his one-man show, soaking in the attention like he always did. She had long since mastered the art of enduring, smiling through the sting of his words, laughing on cue, pretending his jabs didn't cut her like tiny knives. But tonight, something felt different. Maybe it was the way Monica shifted uncomfortably in her seat, or how a few others weren't laughing as enthusiastically as usual. Maybe it was the fact that, after years of standing silent while Ethan erased her confidence, piece by piece, she was finally tired of playing along. And then he said it. "Ooh, and you guys won't believe this," Ethan grinned, taking a long sip of his bourbon before delivering his final blow. "Samantha actually suggested we start trying for kids soon." He chuckled, shaking his head as if it was the most ridiculous thing he had ever heard. "I mean, let's be real. She can barely take care of herself. Imagine her as a mother?" The laughter came, but it wasn't as loud this time. It felt different, uneasy, hesitant. A few exchanged glances, and, for a split second, silence settled over the room. Samantha's stomach dropped. The air left her lungs in a rush, like someone had knocked the wind out of her. Of all the things Ethan could have mocked, he had chosen this? Their infertility struggle. The thing he had begged her to keep quiet about. The thing that had caused so many late-night fights, so much silent grief. Monica's voice was the first to break through the tension. "Ethan, that's..." She hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "That's a little harsh, don't you think?" Ethan, unfazed, waved a dismissive hand. "Oh, come on, it's just a joke. Everyone knows we've been married for 6 years with no kids. It's not exactly a secret." But it was a secret, at least. The real reason was the endless doctor visits, the specialists who confirmed that the problem wasn't with her. The way Ethan had shut down completely after his diagnosis, refusing to acknowledge it, let alone discuss treatment. And now he was painting her as the incapable one. Her as the reason they didn't have a family. Her as the flawed, unworthy wife. Samantha set down her wine glass with calculated precision, her hands steady for the first time all evening. She had spent years protecting Ethan's fragile ego, shrinking herself so he could feel bigger. But tonight she had had enough. She met his smug, self-assured gaze, and for the first time, she didn't look away. "If we're telling funny stories tonight, Ethan," she said, her voice cool, measured, and just loud enough to carry over the room, "maybe you should tell them about your doctor's appointment last year." The smirk slid right off his face. The silence in the room was thick, the weight of Samantha's words suffocating. Ethan's smirk was gone, his grip tightening around his glass as he struggled to mask his panic. Samantha could see it, the momentary flicker of fear behind his confident facade. He never expected her to push back. He had built their marriage on the foundation of her silence, and now, for the first time, she was tearing it apart. But before she let the moment consume her, she needed them, all of them, to understand. They needed to see the full picture of what had been happening behind closed doors. She inhaled deeply, her voice steady, but filled with a quiet anger sharpened by years of restraint. "You know," she said, tilting her head slightly, "I used to think the teasing was harmless. When we first met, Ethan's jokes felt like flirtation. I mistook them for affection, for some kind of playful banter." She let out a small, humorless laugh. "The first time he made fun of me was at a corporate event, spilling my drink on myself. 'Oh, she's adorable when she's flustered,' he told everyone, and I laughed along, thinking it was sweet." Ethan's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. "But then," Samantha continued, scanning the room, "it never stopped. It wasn't just one joke. It became my sense of direction, my work, my cooking, my appearance. It became the way he'd talk about me to others, making up stories just believable enough to make me doubt my own memory. I started to hear his voice in my own head. Every time I hesitated before speaking in meetings, every time I second-guessed myself, every time I wondered if, maybe, just maybe, I really wasn't good enough." The room was completely still. No one dared to move. "But do you know when it got worse?" Samantha's voice dropped slightly, her gaze never leaving Ethan's. 2 years ago? After his diagnosis." Ethan's head jerked up, his eyes blazing. "Samantha!" She ignored him. "I held his hand when we sat in that doctor's office," she said, her voice softer now. "I told him we'd figure it out together, that it didn't change how much I loved him. And what did he do in return?" She let her eyes drift to Monica and the others, watching as realization dawned on their faces. "He started tearing me down. Suddenly, I was the frigid one, the one who wasn't desirable, the one who wasn't enough." Ethan stood up abruptly, knocking over his glass. "That's enough." His voice was sharp, desperate. But Samantha only smiled, a slow, knowing smile. "No, Ethan," she said, her voice unwavering. "It's not nearly enough." Ethan's face had drained of all color, his usual mask of confidence cracking under the weight of a truth he could no longer control. Samantha saw it, the frantic calculation behind his eyes, the desperate scramble for a way out. For years he had mastered twisting reality, turning her into the punchline, and himself into the charismatic, misunderstood husband. But this time, he wasn't in control of the story. This time, Samantha was holding the pen. She slowly pushed back her chair, standing tall as she let her gaze sweep across the room. "You see," she continued, "for 6 years I have let Ethan tell my story. I let him shape the way you all see me, let him chip away at my confidence, piece by piece. And I let it happen because I told myself it was just jokes, that he didn't mean it, that I was being too sensitive. She turned to face her husband directly. But you did mean it, didn't you, Ethan? Ethan forced a laugh, but it sounded hollow. Samantha, come on, you're making a scene. His voice was tight, barely concealing his frustration. Maybe you should get some water. Calm down. Don't patronize me, she cut him off, her voice sharper than it had ever been. Not after everything. The tension in the room was thick, pressing down on everyone like a storm about to break. Across the table, Monica sat forward, her wineglass forgotten, her expression unreadable. Jason looked uneasy, shifting in his seat, while the others exchanged nervous glances. The usual script of the evening had been rewritten, and no one knew what to expect next. Ethan tried again, his voice dipping into something softer, something meant to manipulate. Sweetheart, let's talk about this in private, he murmured, reaching for her wrist in a well-practiced display of affection. But Samantha pulled away, her eyes blazing. No, Ethan, you never worried about privacy when you were humiliating me in front of our friends. She turned back to the others, her voice clear and unwavering. Do you want to know the real reason we don't have children? A stunned silence followed. Samantha felt the shift. The sharp curiosity, the anticipation, the weight of truth hanging in the air. Ethan's composure snapped. That's enough. His voice was loud, panicked, but there was nothing he could do to stop her now. She took a step forward. For 2 years, Ethan has been lying, not just to me, but to all of you, telling you that I'm the problem, that I'm the reason we don't have a family. But here's the truth. She let the words sink in before delivering the final blow. Ethan has erectile dysfunction, and instead of facing it like an adult, he decided to tear me down to make himself feel better. Gasps rippled through the room. Someone muttered Jesus under their breath. Monica's eyes widened while Jason stared down at the table, suddenly very interested in his drink. Ethan lunged toward her, knocking over his glass, his face twisted in rage. You promised, he hissed, his voice barely above a whisper. And you promised to love and respect me, Samantha shot back. Guess we both broke our vows. For the first time since the evening began, Ethan had no comeback, no clever remark, no biting joke, just silence. And it was the most satisfying sound Samantha had ever heard. The silence in the room stretched, thick and suffocating, as Ethan stood there, completely exposed. The man who had spent years mastering the art of humiliation, tearing Samantha down with carefully crafted jokes, had finally lost control of the narrative. He opened his mouth, as if scrambling for a way to salvage his dignity, but nothing came out. The power had shifted, and for once he was the one left speechless. Samantha could feel the weight of years of emotional abuse lifting as she watched the faces around her. No one was laughing anymore. The same people who used to chuckle at Ethan's jokes now looked uncomfortable, embarrassed, ashamed even. Monica met her gaze, her expression unreadable at first. Then something shifted. Recognition, understanding, maybe even admiration. But it wasn't just the guests who were processing what had happened. Samantha could see it in Ethan's eyes, too. The slow, creeping realization that this wasn't just a fleeting moment of embarrassment. This was permanent damage. His carefully cultivated image as the charming, witty lawyer was cracking. And once the truth was out, it couldn't be put back in the box. Desperate, Ethan tried one last time to regain control. He forced a chuckle, a weak, hollow sound. All right. Samantha's had a little too much wine tonight, he said, his voice strained. Let's all just... I'm not drunk, Ethan, Samantha cut him off, her voice steady. I'm just done. The words settled over the room, final and unwavering. Ethan stiffened, his jaw clenching so tight it looked painful. Don't be ridiculous, he muttered. lowering his voice so only she could hear. "You're not going to leave me over a few jokes." Samantha let out a breath, not in anger, but in relief. "It was never about the jokes," she said, meeting his gaze without flinching for the first time in years. "It was about how you needed to make me feel small, just so you could feel big." She turned to the guests, to the people who had spent years enabling Ethan's behavior, whether they realized it or not. "Thank you all for coming," she said, her tone polite yet firm. "I think the party's over." One by one, people began grabbing their coats and purses, murmuring awkward goodbyes as they filed out. No one wanted to be the last person left standing beside Ethan. Monica hesitated, then walked up to Samantha and squeezed her hand. No words were exchanged, but the message was clear. "I see you, I understand, and you're not alone." By the time the last guest had left, Ethan was still standing there, his expression a mix of anger and disbelief. "You really think you can just walk away from this?" he scoffed. Samantha smiled, a real, genuine smile. "I don't think," she said simply. "I know." And with that, she walked away. For the first time, truly free. 6 months had passed since Samantha walked away from Ethan, and in that time, her life had transformed in ways she never could have imagined. Gone were the days of second-guessing herself, of forcing a laugh at her own expense, of shrinking in his shadow. She was no longer the punchline. She was the one telling her own story. Her apartment was different now, not the one she had shared with Ethan, but a sleek modern loft overlooking the Chicago skyline, a space that was entirely her own. No more walking on eggshells, no more pretending to be someone she wasn't. She decorated it with things she loved, filling the space with vibrant colors, warm lighting, and bookshelves lined with novels she had always wanted to read but never had the time or the confidence to pick up. Everything in this space reflected her, not the person Ethan had molded her into. Work had flourished too. Without Ethan's constant belittling, she found herself stepping into her role as a senior financial analyst with newfound confidence. She spoke up in meetings without hesitation, pitched bold strategies, and took on challenges she once might have doubted herself over. Isabel, her boss, noticed the change immediately. "You've always been good at this, Samantha," she had said one afternoon over coffee. "You just finally started believing it." But perhaps the most unexpected change was the friendship she had formed with Monica. The night of the dinner party had been a turning point for both of them. Inspired by Samantha's courage, Monica had filed for divorce from Jason just a month later. "Watching you stand up to Ethan," she had admitted over a cup of coffee at their favorite cafe, "made me realize how much I had been excusing in my own marriage." Now, the two women met regularly, sharing stories, not of humiliation, but of growth, healing, and finally finding joy in their own independence. They laughed freely, without the weight of someone else's judgment looming over them. As for Ethan, his downfall had been swift. Word had spread quickly through their social circles. The same people who once laughed at his jokes now avoided him at gatherings. His charm had lost its effect when people started seeing the man behind the mask, a man who had spent years tearing down his wife to cover up his own insecurities. Samantha ran into him once, at a restaurant where he was dining alone, attempting to charm a waitress with his usual sarcastic quips, but this time, no one was laughing. When he saw her, he smirked, his last attempt at control. "Still can't take a joke, Samantha?" She simply smiled, her confidence unwavering. "Oh, I can take a joke," she said. "I just finally realized you were one." And with that, she walked away, not just from Ethan, but from the person she used to be. This time, she was walking toward something better. Herself. The soft hum of conversation and the clinking of glasses filled the upscale steakhouse restaurant as Samantha stepped inside, scanning the room for Monica. It had been months since she had last seen Ethan, and she had no real reason to think about him until now. There he was, sitting alone at a dimly lit table, a half-finished drink in front of him. She watched for a moment as he attempted his usual charm on the young waitress, cracking a joke, flashing that same smirk he had used for years, but something was different. The waitress offered only a polite smile before walking away, unimpressed. The power he once wielded, the effortless charisma, the ability to make people laugh at his jokes, was fading. As if sensing her presence, Ethan looked up, and their eyes met. For a split second, something flickered in his gaze, surprise, maybe even regret. Then, as expected, he plastered on his signature smirk, the last remnant of a man who had once been so sure of his control. "Well, well, if it isn't my favorite critic," he drawled, leaning back in his chair. "Tell me, Samantha, are you finally learning to take a joke?" Samantha felt a slow, confident smile spread across her lips. For the first time in years, she felt nothing toward him. No anger, no resentment, no pain. Just clarity. She tilted her head slightly and met his gaze. "Oh, I can take a joke, Ethan," she said smoothly. "I just finally realized you were one." And with that she turned and walked away, leaving him in the one thing he had feared most. Silence. As Samantha stepped out of the restaurant, she took a deep breath, feeling the crisp Chicago air fill her lungs. For the first time in years, she felt completely free. There was no lingering weight of self-doubt, no anxious need to prove her worth to someone who never deserved her in the first place. She had spent so long shrinking herself to fit into Ethan's world, bending over backward to be the perfect wife, the perfect target for his jokes. But now, she was done being anyone's punchline. Her life wasn't just different, it was hers. She was thriving at work, embracing opportunities she once feared. She had built real friendships, the kind that weren't based on shared laughter at someone else's expense. And most importantly, she had learned that her value was never tied to Ethan's approval, or anyone else's. As she walked down the street, the city lights glowing around her, she caught a glimpse of her reflection in a shop window. For the first time in a long time, she recognized the woman staring back at her. Samantha Carter had reclaimed her confidence, her voice, and her joy. And this time, she wasn't letting anyone take it away. The story of Samantha Carter teaches a powerful lesson about self-worth, boundaries, and the danger of excusing emotional abuse as humor. For years, she endured public humiliation, convincing herself that Ethan's cruel jokes were harmless. But the truth is, words have power, and repeated belittlement, whether masked as humor or not, can erode confidence and self-esteem. One of the most important takeaways is that silence enables mistreatment. Samantha spent years protecting Ethan's ego, keeping his secrets while he broadcasted her flaws. But once she chose to speak her truth, the power shifted. The moment she refused to laugh along, Ethan's hold over her crumbled. This story also highlights the importance of choosing the right people to surround yourself with. When Samantha finally stood up for herself, she found true friends in Monica and Isabel, who supported her growth instead of tearing her down. Ultimately, the biggest lesson is that reclaiming your confidence is the best form of revenge. Samantha didn't just walk away, she thrived. She built a life where she was no longer someone's joke, but the author of her own success. And in doing so, she proved that true strength comes from knowing your worth and refusing to let anyone diminish it.